we're all good to go. Can you stop by the reception to talk for a little bit? Okay, good. No, I'll do that once he gives me the thumbs up with the time, because I'm not sure I'm on the right time here. Okay. Welcome to our Science for Seminaries campus event, which is part of our seminary's 2-year participation in a grant with the American Academy for the Advancement of Science in the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. We are most grateful to participate in this worthy endeavor to bring science education into the American seminaries and to open a deeper engagement between faith and science. We are blessed to have with us 4 renowned speakers, with 1 presentation this evening and 3 tomorrow morning to discuss what we are calling the Gospel of Jesus Christ in Big History. We have Peter Casarella this evening, a theologian from Duke University, and then tomorrow Philip Currian, a theoretical physicist from Howard University, Jeff Schloss, a biologist from Westmont College in Santa Barbara, and Father John Carche, the rector of Mundelein Seminary, who is expert in both sacred scripture and astrophysics. The expression big history that we use in the title of our event refers to the idea that human history is interconnected with the total history of the universe, and that the universe is itself indeed a vast history and not a static structure. Physical nature is not a fixed backdrop to human history, but is a historical developmental process intertwined with human history and reaching back to the Big Bang or beyond. The idea of evolutionary big history is a result of 19th and 20th century discoveries in biology, geology, and cosmology. In the same time period, a theological ressourcement, or return to the sources, rediscovered the scriptural and patristic theme of the cosmic headship of Christ. Jesus Christ, it was asserted anew, is not only the head of the church or humanity or planet Earth, but of the entire universe. I am referring here to the much discussed ecumenical theme of the cosmic Christ. Development of this theme has elicited dialogue between theology and different sciences, including physics, evolutionary biology, and cosmology, a dialogue which we wish to extend tonight and tomorrow. We start this evening with a presentation from the theological side with Dr. Casarella, who is giving this evening our annual Thomas Lecture in Theology and Philosophy, with which we have conjoined our overall campus event. Dr. Casarella was appointed to the faculty of Duke University Divinity School in 2020. Formerly, he was an associate professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame from 2013 to 2020, and served as director of the Latin American, North American Church Concerns Project in the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. He served as professor of Catholic Studies from 2007 to 2013 at DePaul University, where he was also the founding director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. He has published a monograph, Word as Bread, Language and Theology in Nicholas of Cusa, and a collection of his own essays, Reverberations of the Word, Wounded Beauty in Global Catholicism, as well as many other essays on a broad array of topics. I believe it was our own Dr. Sarala who once said to me that Dr. Casarella is an expert in everything. Without further ado, Dr. Casarella.
Thank you, Dr. Lemna, for that overly generous introduction. I'd really like to meet that guy. So the title of my presentation is The Surprising Scope of Christ's Cosmic Love, Big History After Laudato Si. For those of you who like structure and organization, here's just a brief overview of what I want to attempt to do this evening. I'll talk about the convergence first between the Ignatian and the Franciscans, starting with the choice of the name by Pope Francis. And then I'll talk about the view of beauty, the harmony in the world, in Laudato Si, this encyclical of Pope Francis, trying to bring out the Franciscan element, then turn to the Ignatian notion of contemplation and action as seen through Laudato Si, and then bring together this Franciscan vision of beauty with the Ignatian form of engagement, and then finally draw some conclusions to segue us into the discussion tomorrow with the scientists about what this all means for Catholic education. So many of us were surprised on February 28th, 2013, at the papal election of Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio from Argentina. One of the most shocked was Cardinal Bergoglio himself. This is a typical picture of the Cardinal from Argentina, known to be very severe and ascetical by his confreres in Buenos Aires. And I went and interviewed them and spoke to them about it. Of course, shortly after his election, he wrote The Joy of the Gospel. He, that is Cardinal Bergoglio, is reported to have said that as things got dangerous, his term, in the conclave voting, he was sitting next to his friend, Brazilian Cardinal Claudio Gomes, who comforted me. The exchange between these two men did not end there. Immediately after the election, the new Pope reported to the press, Cardinal Gomes hugged me, kissed me, and said, "Don't forget the poor." When later asked about the choice of the papal name, the first Jesuit pope in the history of the Church acknowledged that he took to heart the words of his Brazilian colleague. Pope Francis told reporters that he considered St. Francis the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects the environment. I initially found it surprising that Bergoglio did not choose Francis Xavier, the name of another Jesuit. He signaled, with the unexpected name from another religious congregation, a preferential option for the poor, as well as a promise to remind the entire world that the earth is our common home. Finally, the Argentine Pope, with familiar roots in the Piedmont region of Italy, crossed the divide between the spirituality of the 13th century Italian, St. Francis of Assisi, and the 16th century native Spanish speaker, St. Ignatius of Loyola. So in this lecture this evening, I would like to explore the theological dimensions of big history that are found in the papal encyclical on the environment, on our common home, namely Laudato Si. By big history, and Dr. Lemna just gave us a short introduction to this, by big history I mean the new integrated approach to teaching the 14 billion years of cosmic evolution since the Big Bang, an approach that has enjoyed enormous success with high school students and beyond. In the words of one of its proponents, big history links different areas of knowledge into one unified story. It's a framework for learning about anything and everything. This unified story provides students with a deeper awareness of our past, hopefully better preparing them to shape the future, end of quote. In order for the teachers of big history to make these links, they must be able to draw upon wisdom from the past, both scientific wisdom from the past and spiritual giants. In the 20th century, the Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin offered such a model of integration with his new view of what he called the surprising but gradual emergence of the human noosphere. Today, Laudato Si presents a similar integration, one that takes into account even more complex systems of interaction on the biological, social, and spiritual dimensions of life. Without this recognition, we may fail to exercise our duty to protect and preserve the earth as our common home. Laudato Si unfolds a vision of big history that even acknowledges the contribution of Teilhard de Chardin by pointing to, quote, the measure of the maturity of all things that the risen Christ has achieved through God's own insertion in cosmic history. I have a particular angle of interpretation that I'd like to pursue about the form of big history that is unfolded by Pope Francis in Laudato Si, and it has to do with the name Francis. In Laudato Si, we see a unique convergence of the Franciscan theological aesthetic with the Ignatian spirituality of contemplation and action. In other words, we are introduced to big history by thinking simultaneously and in concert with one another about a vision of divine beauty inspired by the saint from Assisi and a modern program of social action that has its roots in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Now, before investigating the two components of this strange brew, as well as the new synthesis offered by Francis, let us first pause to think about the problematic status of bringing together in our contemporary life a vision of beauty and a program of social action. The modern view of aesthetics is not necessarily, in and of itself, normative. It could be an aesthetic that, as the philosopher Immanuel Kant says in his Critique of Judgment, upholds a modern subjective sense of beauty in nature, in his words, a vision of the world of purposiveness without purpose. Objective norms are detached from subjective judgments. We are uplifted in this way in a romantic burst of emotion by what we see, but not offered moral guidance that leads us towards a common good. The essential conditions of contemporary life, even without factoring the recent trauma of COVID-19 into them, make it even more challenging to think about a program of social action that is guided by a normative vision of reality. Teilhard de Chardin was already aware of the problem in his time. Once we begin to ponder the unlikeliness of the emergence of genuine and markedly human thought from the existing evolution of the cosmos, the appearance of the so-called noosphere, he writes, "This perspective is at first sight disconcerting, running counter as it does to the illusion and habits which incline us to measure events by their material face." 1 year after Teilhard published The Phenomenon of Man, philosopher Hannah Arendt delivered lectures at the University of Chicago on the problematic status of the active life, vita activa. Like Teilhard, Arendt worried about the rise and fall of the mid-20th century technocratic activists, the new homo faber. And she said that this had only met with a vague ethic of life as the highest good, and no common moral precepts for public life. 60 years later, the West is outraged by the unjust aggression in Ukraine and paralyzed by the threat of the use of nuclear weapons by a dictator in Moscow. More so, perhaps, than even in the midst of the actual Cold War. Today, we glimpse the real possibility of the non-existence of the earth and wonder how we will gain any moral traction for the sake of social renewal in the face of that earth-shattering predicament. Beauty of the sort that compelled St. Francis to write his wondrous hymn, Laudato Si, O Signore, praise be thou, O Lord of the creation, still compels us to look for a big picture. But the connections between beauty and justice are more elusive than ever. In our current state, our souls can be filled with the noblest intentions for enacting beauty, but we still feel at the very same existential level absolutely powerless to take action. How will we find a way forward that acknowledges both the uninterrupted advance in our technocratic power over nature and the equally powerful yearnings of the human soul to grasp meaning in and through nature? So, the first part, the Franciscan aesthetic in Laudato Si. Here you have the beautiful, one of the many paintings of the life of Francis by the artist Giotto. That itself could be a whole lecture about Giotto's love for Francis and how he depicted human form so beautifully in all of his paintings. But let's go back to Laudato Si. Laudato Si offers us a way out of this impasse. I will begin by painting a portrait of the Franciscan vision of creation, and then in the third part of the talk, turn to the Ignatian program for social action. In the fourth part, I will speak about the specific antidote that Laudato Si may offer to that feeling of being paralyzed. The hymn Laudato Si opens the meditation and is invoked in chapter 2, part 4, but I will not offer exegesis of that critical framing of the question of the community of all things in creation. Instead, I will show that the Franciscan theology of the triune love of God, traced into the created order, suffuses the reading of the entire encyclical. The spiritual core of Laudato Si is the recognition that when we look at creation in its biblical and theological sense, we see more than just nature. And I quote, "Nature is usually seen as a system which can be studied, understood, and controlled, whereas creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father in all, and as a reality illuminated by the love which calls us together into universal communion, end of quote. This critical insight accords with the Franciscan view of creation, whereby the world of nature in its vastness is the expression of a loving, intelligent creator. As a reflection of the richness of the created source, the cosmos can hardly be one-dimensional. If nature has no meaning and purpose beyond its own self-subsistence, it remains opaque. If nature is created by a being who transcends the finite limits of nature, it can be seen as a cipher of a reality beyond itself. I'm not trying here to offer a proof for the existence of God, but rather to speak to the difference that faith in a creator makes when gazing at the world. Faith does not see a different world, but sees the world differently, i.e. multi-dimensionally. In different terms, life is a miracle, as Wendell Berry properly noted in his critique of the reductionist biologist Edmund Wilson. Pope Francis reads the order of creation through the common work of the Trinity. The Trinity has left its mark on creation, and we must praise the Trinity in the contemplation of creation. According to St. Bonaventure, each, and this is quoted in the encyclical, each creature testifies that God is three, but human sinfulness has darkened our eyes to this radiant splendor. Pope Francis also notes that what is most distinctive about the Trinitarian view of creation in St. Francis himself. Citing from Bonaventure's Major Life of Francis, he states, quote, "From a reflection on the primary source of all things, filled with even more abundant piety, he would call creatures, no matter how small, by the name of brother or sister." St. Francis gave us very vivid image of the brotherhood and sisterhood of all created beings. The individual items of creation are gathered into a community by God in the manner of the letters and words that compose an attractive book, or the well-ordered notes of a harmonious song. The Catechism of the Catholic Church affirms this idea by noting the interdependence of all creatures. Community in the created order has thus both an ontic and a deontic function. We are called both to see a community and to realize a community. This specific, quote-unquote, community of creation is being damaged by our current ecological crisis. The non-romantic Franciscan view of cosmic community defended in Laudato Si gives us critical leverage for thinking about this predicament. The encyclical is in fact rife with specific examples. Barren coral reefs, for example, are described as underwater cemeteries bereft of color and life. The Pope states even more forthrightly, the earth, our common home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. This is Argentine forthrightness, by the way. Pope Francis ties his critique of pollution to a technocratic and profit-driven mentality that proves incapable of seeing the mysterious network between things, and so sometimes solves one problem only to create others. He ties this reduction in vision to the advent of this is a very important phrase, a throwaway culture, which affects the excluded just as quickly as it reduces things to rubbish. There is a closely knit bond between our mistreatment of vulnerable persons and our disregard for the introduction of toxic substances into the air, the water, and life-sustaining systems. Just as the ontic and the deontic go together without collapsing one into the other, so too do we join our awareness of interpersonal relationships with our relatedness to the earth as our common home. A final example is the Amazon, about which Pope Francis has published a separate post-synodal exhortation. I'm going to read this quote. It's very beautiful. This is from Laudato Si. Let us mention, for example, those richly biodiverse lungs of our planet, which are the Amazon and the Congo basins, or the great aquifers and glaciers. We know how important these are for the entire Earth and for the future of humanity. The ecosystems of tropical forests possess an enormously complex biodiversity, which is almost impossible to appreciate fully. Yet when these forests are burned down or leveled for purposes of cultivation, within the space of a few years, countless species are lost, and the areas frequently become arid wastelands. A delicate balance has to be maintained when speaking about these places, for we cannot overlook the huge global economic interests which, under the guise of protecting them, can undermine the sovereignty of individual nations. In fact, there are proposals to internationalize the Amazon, which would only serve the economic interests of transnational corporations, end of quote. Notice here how the reference to the quote-unquote lungs of our planet does not remain a pretty metaphor hanging in the air, but translates into a call to action to prohibit transnational corporations from taking control of these biological resources and damaging the sovereignty of nations and of peoples in that process. The aesthetic element in the Pope's rhetoric in this instance is a healthy shock, to use a phrase once employed by Pope Benedict, a healthy shock that awakens the inhabitants of the planet into action. This enjoinder that our planet has richly biodiverse lungs is also a good example of how the criteria of discerning between the inclusive categories of people and anti-people are so intimately woven together in the fabric of Francis's ecological vision. I don't have time to go into this right now, but a lot of my recent research has been on the theology of the people. Here's an example of Cardinal Bergoglio in Argentina. Listen to the philosopher Metol Ferre from Uruguay. And this opposition that we serve people, but people as an inclusive concept, and is a way of getting beyond and actually critiquing the Marxist class struggle. So we're looking at helping a people as a whole, where many peoples, the indigenous, the poor, and even the well-off can work together. Anyway, I can go into that at more length, but I wanted to at least give some of the Argentine political roots of his thinking at least a nod. Another more widely known principle, drawn from the tradition of Catholic social teaching that undergirds the encyclical, is the common destination of all goods on the earth. Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si, the principle of the subordination of private property to the universal destinations of goods, and thus the right of anyone to their use, is a golden rule of social conduct, and the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. The right use of land is a critical question for the world today that cuts through many of the discrete social ills treated in the encyclical. One corollary of the common destination of all goods is the attention paid to refugees who had to flee their homes because of environmental degradation. Pope Francis is equally interested in the land and its inhabitants. Given the prevalence of the anthropic principle, one cannot separate one from the other. In other words, the cry of the earth is not separate from the cry of the poor. A failure to attend to the proper custodianship of the earth has a direct impact on the poor, the marginalized, and especially, as we see in this picture here, the climate refugees. So, St. Francis, as a poor man who loves the poor, is not a different Francis from the one who sings a hymn to the earth as our sister. Christ is, in the words of Zachary Hayes, the hidden center of the Franciscan vision of the world. St. Francis marked his life, and even some of his letters, with the Tau, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The letter also symbolized, through the perpendicular axis, which images the cross, the presence of the cross of Christ at the center of one's life. St. Francis lived his life not only with the mark of the Tau on him, but for the sake of giving expression to this cruciform symbolism in his daily life. So what about the Christology? What about Christ's role as the firstborn of all creation in Laudato Si? Pope Francis directly addresses, and this is the subtitle in the encyclical, the gaze of Christ, and writes, from the beginning of the world, but particularly through the incarnation, the mystery of Christ is at work in a hidden manner in the natural world as a whole, without thereby impinging on its autonomy. The creatures of this world no longer appear to us under the merely natural guise because the risen one is mysteriously holding them to himself and directing them toward fullness as their end. The very flowers of the field and birds which his human eyes contemplated and admired are now imbued with his radiant presence. End of quote. So rather than wearing the tau on one's breast in order to encourage cruciformity in word and deed, Pope Francis adopts in a more Ignatian manner the Jesuit stance of seeing God as always greater, semper maior, always greater than we can conceive. Christ teaches his followers to look upward to God the Father in order to see the Creator in all things by comparing the kingdom of God to a mustard seed in a well-known parable. Christ is also, and this is very, very important, Christ is also the worker who learned to toil and use his hands to craft the material world in a non-dualish fashion. He crafts these goods for human consumption in such a way that it accompanies the redemption of humanity. And this is also mentioned and noteworthy in this context. St. Benedict's view of manual labor as spiritually meaningful proved, and this is the Pope's words, proved revolutionary. Dorothy Day and Peter Morin were on this basis and through their collaboration with Remberg Sorg convinced that the Benedictine tradition of holy work had the right resources for economic renewal broadly construed. Anyway, in the encyclical, Christ is also the hidden center, especially as the one who engages the material reality of the world and allows us to see what is outward from the inward space of the world's theandric, that is divine, simultaneously divine and human meaning. Okay, so that was the Franciscan vision. Let's turn now to the Ignatian element. And as I did in that last part, I'll first focus on the Ignatian, and then we'll get to the relationship between the two, which I think is the genuinely creative part. This is a picture of St. Ignatius walking, but as you know, at the preface to the spiritual exercise, and also in many of the commentaries that Pope Francis himself is giving, the image of walking has to do with bringing the exercises into your daily life. It's the daily examen. It's a daily meditation that's signified by walking. Michel de Certeau has some influence on him in this regard, but that's another lecture. The Ignatian ideal of contemplation in action is grounded in the spiritual exercises. Ignatius uses the term elección to refer to the choice of a state of life that will result from meditating the life of Christ for 30 days. We are chosen. It's different from election, I think. I think to use the Spanish here is relevant. We are chosen, we are elected, somos elegidos, through a free process of discernment of spirits. We are not choosers in the sense of creating self-made persons. This arduous process is supposed to take place in the second week of the exercises, but can be transferred to other settings and using shorter forms of self-examination. The main point is not to end the meditation with a concept or abstract awareness, but rather to end it with a readiness to engage in the world. What is also different here from the Franciscan vision is the explicit acknowledgement of the competing forces that are ingrained systemically in the struggle to discern. There's some of that in Francis, but it's not in the foreground in the same way. This tension is expressed during the second week in the form of a struggle to choose the banner of Christ as opposed to the banner of the devil. And that's a very important symbolism for what I'm now about to talk about. This Ignatian ideal occupies a special place in the thought of young Bergoglio in Argentina, where he served as provincial seminary rector and later as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. Here is not the place to review all that has been written about the Pope's Ignatian roots and Ignatian philosophy of life as it developed in that context. But one of the key traits of this formation was the capacity to hold seemingly opposed ideas in tension and using the Ignatian process of discernment to find a path that would indicate a way forward by entering into the seeming polarity between these opposites. So being faithful to one's Argentine roots, and especially thinking about the poor in the middle of the city of Buenos Aires, remember his mantra that he uses many times, even in Madison Square Garden, God lives in the city. So remaining faithful to one's Argentine roots and the people in Argentina while remaining faithful to a global Catholic communion is one clear example of this kind of tension that he lived through. But it's a productive tension. It's a good tension. So in order to think about the problem of polarities, the young Bergoglio read a Spanish translation of a book by Romano Guardini, a very early book of Guardini that's called Der Gegensatz, the opposites. It's a little-known work of the celebrated philosopher and priest from Munich. And here I have a slide of actually Pope Francis talking about the importance of Gardini in his own formation. There are many ties linking Bergoglio to the thought of Gardini. The young Bergoglio began but did not finish a dissertation at the Jesuit faculty in Frankfurt on the philosophy of encounter in Gardini. Another text of Gardini's, The End of the Modern World, is frequently cited in Laudato Si. Bergoglio delivered, in 1989, Bergoglio delivered a lecture on political anthropology at the Colegio del Salvador in Buenos Aires. In that lecture, he heralded Gardini's The End of the Modern World as the prophetic key to the emerging reality of postmodernism. Gardini's book, you have to remember, was originally delivered as, that's why I put this first edition here in this slide, was originally delivered as lectures in the late 1940s and then published in 1950. It was not written to address the European postmodernism that became kind of dominant in university United States in the mid-'80s and Argentina soon thereafter. It was written in the wake of World War II with a view to the brokenness and fragility of the human situation at that juncture in history, just after the Second World War. The original version, you can barely see it in the slide, but the original version even bore a hopeful subtitle, Ein Versuch zur Orientierung. So it's the end of the modern world, which sounds very dour and apocalyptic, but it's actually an attempt at finding one's way, an attempt to find an orientation in the midst of this crisis. Now, Bergoglio, even in his 89 lecture, grasped the connection between the two cultural realities and argued that Gardini had profound insights into Christian anthropology for our times. So just a word about this text of Gardini. In The End of the Modern World, Gardini isolated what he saw as the post-World War II predicament with regard to the Christian approach to the problem of modern freedom. Ancient pagan thought tested human freedom against a finite horizon and did not recognize the openness to transcendence that Christianity brought with it. Medieval thought broke through that threshold, but still thought about the gift of finite freedom in relationship to a hierarchical understanding of being. That metaphysical framework was permanently punctured, Gardini says, by modernity's self-made image of freedom, which abandoned the backdrop of a metaphysical frame and replaced it with the dissecting, scrutinizing approach of modern experimental science. Romanticism, here epitomized by Goethe, Romanticism, epitomized by Goethe, attempted a return to thinking about the cosmic whole, but submerged human freedom into that whole without granting it any autonomy. The Industrial Revolution and then the bloodshed of the first half of the 20th century, the two world wars, changed everything. After the unprecedented rise of atomic weapons and the violent ideologies of these two global wars, humanity, Gardini said, lost its faith in diverse modern humanisms. Culture became uncultural. Nature became unnatured. Even the modern humanly measured idea of God put forth by Rousseau, Freud, and Marx had to be rejected. The pagan synthesis that reigned prior to Christianity now gave way to, and this is my favorite phrase from the whole book, now gave way to an unpagan paganism that is terrified by the new human power to destroy the entire earth, but equally blinded by its own seemingly permanent spiritual unmooring. Man, Gardini writes, does not have power over his own powers. Christian anthropology must urgently find a way to affirm the proper destiny of a human capacity to remake the world over which it still holds dominion, that is neither naively humanistic nor overtly instrumental, or what he would call Promethean. Gardini did not see a clear path out of this predicament, but he isolated three postmodern virtues that could respond to the new situation: earnestness, gravity, and asceticism. All three of these virtues are in complete attunement, as it turns out, with the Ignatian philosophical outlook of weighing contrasts that Bergoglio had made his own. For earnestness, Gardini writes, we must brush aside empty rhetoric extolling progress or the conquest of nature. Gravity entails the courage to grasp the destructiveness of atom bombs, or, this is somewhat prescient, bacteriological warfare, in order to restrain the chaos rising out of the very works of the human person. Gardini's virtue of asceticism is not the grim and lonely pessimism that has lost faith in every cultural project. He believes that we must become true masters of self-governance, modeled on the self-abnegation of Christ, in order to maintain bravery in the face of temptations to join what he calls mass man. This self-abnegation includes the humility to enter into solidarity with one's fellow human beings. So it's very important to see how these virtues don't lead to pulling yourself out and giving up, but actually in this Ignatian fashion lead to engagement. So Romano Guardini, I want to argue, is a key philosophical source for the Laudato Si. But the practical seeds for an environmental encyclical were planted well before the pontificate as well. In 2003, Cardinal Bergoglio, as Archbishop of Buenos Aires and Chancellor of the Catholic University of Argentina, invited a lay charismatic Catholic and atmospheric physicist named Dr. Pablo Canziani to create a program at the Catholic University of Argentina that examined both environmental science and social concerns. At the same time, the Latin American bishops, particularly at that time one of the active ones is now Cardinal Pedro, the Archbishop of Huancayo. At the same time, the Latin American bishops were dealing with a potentially incendiary problem between Argentina and Uruguay because of a giant pulp mill, one of the pulp mills from that region are just depicted here, that was being built on the border, the border between Argentina and Uruguay, on the Uruguay River, and it was being built by a North American-based transnational concern. Canziani was later also, and there's a picture of Canziani here from the early days of Bergoglio. Canziani was also a technical advisor to the bishops on this delicate question, and then helped them to see the deleterious role that the multinational corporations could play in environmental matters. Bergoglio appears to have become convinced of the importance of an ecological awareness through this process, dialoguing with Canziani, trying to set up a program at the university, and then working with the other Latin American bishops on this politically very sensitive issue. Later, Pope Francis brought Canziani into the team that offered technical expertise for Laudato Si. This is just one of many of the technical experts that were brought into the advising capacity for Laudato Si. So I'm emphasizing more philosophical, theological side of the document, but you have to see that it's to bring together a team of natural scientists, social scientists, and philosophers and theologians. So both theoretical and practical concerns shape Francis's vision of contemplation and ecological action. What does Laudato Si actually say about our ability to harness the power of technology in order to protect the earth as our common home? Pope Francis is principally guided by Gardini's End of the Modern World, but he rereads Gardini with an overtly Ignatian hermeneutic. He recognizes with the prior Catholic tradition that the creation of the human person and the responsible stewardship accorded to human persons rightly deserve to be placed at the center of God's gift of creation. He does not wish, and this is very important, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on this very question. Pope Francis does not wish to replace a proper Christian anthropocentrism with a secular biocentrism. Following Gardini, the Pope critiques both the technocratic paradigm, that almost becomes a mantra in his writing about ecology. He critiques both the technocratic paradigm and what he calls misguided anthropocentrism. Not all anthropocentrism, but misguided anthropocentrism. In both instances, things go awry when social programs are built solely on the basis of the expertise of experts in the sciences who think that an advanced technical mastery over nature will yield progress and uphold human dignity for all peoples just on its own. This Baconian model of education still holds sway in many centers of learning. But there's a legitimate role for the exercise of technological prowess, which the Pope defines as follows, and I quote, because this is very important to show the other side of it. He says in Laudato Si, liberation from the dominant technocratic paradigm does in fact happen sometimes. For example, when cooperatives of small producers adopt less polluting means of production and opt for a non-consumerist model of life, recreation, and community. Or when technology is directed primarily to resolving people's concrete problems, truly helping them to live with more dignity and less suffering. Or indeed, when the desire to create and contemplate beauty manages to overcome reductionism through a kind of salvation which occurs in beauty and in those who behold it. He has a great, he talks about this in Dare We Hope, he has a great faith in creativity and artistry coming together with social change. The desire to harness technology to genuine human needs need not be restricted to isolated instances of community-supported agriculture or the occasional visit to a Catholic worker farm, although these ideal instances of this vision should never be dishonored. The technocratic paradigm has powerful forces behind it, including multinational corporations with their own philanthropic enterprises. There's no simple solution that allows us to resist its charms. Okay, let me turn now to the next section, spiritual vision and social action, discerning our place in an emerging cosmos. The Franciscan Jesuit is urging us to move beyond an occasional spurt or quick fix of anti-technocracy. He's calling for a new vision of humanity and for finding the authentic place of the human in the cosmos. He acknowledges in a highly poetic fashion, and I read the encyclical several times and didn't notice this particular phrase. He acknowledges in a highly poetic fashion the curious presence of this new vision of humanity already in our very midst. This is the quote. He says, an authentic humanity calling for a new synthesis seems to dwell in the midst of our technological culture, almost unnoticed, like a mist seeping gently beneath a closed door. I don't know where he got that. Like a mist seeping gently beneath a closed door. And then he continues, will the promise last in spite of everything, with all that is authentic rising up in stubborn resistance? Okay, that's Laudato Si. So the metaphor is striking because it beckons for exactly the form of discernment that Ignatius enjoins upon the exercitant in the second week of the spiritual exercises. In the midst of this ecological crisis, we do not face an open door in front of us. The ecologically insensitive bearers of the standard of Satan, and I use that in the strictly Ignatian sense, have closed that door. But with a proper vision, the mist of this stubborn, resistant new humanity can be seen as emerging from beneath the very door that has been closed. Rising mist sounds less positive and less available than a plastic bottle of water half full and waiting to be drunk. But rising mist is actually an apt metaphor for describing the spiritual predicament of humanity today. In other words, we need both a new vision that will allow us to reopen the door and a new form of social engagement that will guide us once that door is opened. The problem is not altogether new. Even Teilhard de Chardin recognized the quote-unquote modern disquiet with the problem of action. In a purely technocratic world, we are bombarded by the sheer enormity of space, the equal enormity of the world's duration, which is a plain fact if we're teaching big history, and bewildering numbers that attempt to offer the definitive account of the physiognomy of our daily life. Technical experts reign without being criticized, and the wisdom to see what is really in front of us is thereby eclipsed. In the midst of this frenzy, we still need to do something about the world's wounds. We cannot find our way out of this impasse without both vision and a plan of action. Action without vision represents a blind exercise of power, what Kant called percepts without concepts. Vision without action represents the paralysis that results from placing unattainable ideas and sense of political directives above the concrete life of a people. Kant's concepts without percepts. We need to find a path from the relativistic hegemony of the technocratic paradigm to the search for the framework of the common good, one that is normative, reiterative, and dialogical. Let me focus on just one aspect of Laudato Si's constructive program, the need to protect employment. Any approach to integral ecology needs to take into account the value of labor, Pope Francis writes. He says, St. Francis's awe-filled contemplation of creation is cited as one Christian path to see the beauty of what is produced when a worker makes something out of the raw materials of the earth. But the point is to find meaningful jobs for the unemployed and not just to revel in the nostalgia for a lost world of agricultural creativity. As Pope Francis says later in Fratelli Tutti, In a genuinely developed society, work is an essential development of social life, for it is not only a means to earning one's daily bread, but also of personal growth, the building of healthy relationships, self-expression, and exchange of gifts. Work gives us a sense of shared responsibility for the development of the world, and ultimately for our life as a people, end of quote. The church is not just another expert in the still necessary technical field of job creation, the promotion of a free economy of healthy entrepreneurship. But the voice of the church must stand firm even in the face of strong counterwinds in order to promote these ethical ideas regarding the value of work. Economic systems can be submitted to ethical analysis. Small is beautiful, as Ernst Schumpeter once said. Pope Francis talks about economies of scale, especially in the agricultural sector. He alludes to the creativity, but also the danger of biotechnology and genetic mutations as new fields in which the restraint of ethical norms will be particularly important, even when gains can be found in feeding the world or serving humanity. Okay, so the picture, coming close to the end now, the picture of big history that emerges from Laudato Si is one that is steeped in the Christian tradition of spiritual discernment. Does Laudato Si offer something to this long history? Alejandro Garcia Rivera, in his final work, The Garden of God, borrows the phrase, the entangled bank, from Charles Darwin in order to meditate on the need for disciplined spiritual technologies. So Alex Garcia Rivera actually taught at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, but was also an oblate of the Camaldolese monastery in Big Sur. And he befriended an artist named Arthur Poulin. So in all of his books, including I have the cover page for the cover of Garden of God, he had a painting by Father Poulin who would paint looking over Big Sur. And so you see the sunflowers and this kind of post-impressionist meditation on a field of Father Arthur Poulin, a monk. Like Teilhard and Pope Francis, Garcia Rivera realizes that a biblically and spiritually tenable Christocentric cosmology is the only way that believers in Christian revelation can find their own place in the order of being. What Garcia Rivera, taught at Jesuit Seminary, taught there until his untimely death in 2010, has a lot in common with Pope Francis, and it is namely the focus on the interior nexus between forging a new theological aesthetics of nature and the disciplining of our social concerns. I think this metaphor of the entangled bank, then adopted from Darwin but given a new Christocentric thrust by Pope Francis, Teilhard de Chardin, and Garcia Rivera, is a very helpful way to go forward and think about big history. So conclusion, just some final brief thoughts about big history and Catholic education. At the core of the message of Pope Francis is a goad to ecological conversion that includes a greater awareness of one's own personal errors, sins, faults and failures, personal conversion, as well as the establishment of educational programs that are curricular, formative, and open to new forms of collaboration, internally as well as externally. That project can seem dizzying if it's not grounded in the place in which we find ourselves. We can start with thinking about the very land on which we teach, recalling that Francis told the friars to leave part of the garden untouched, so that in contemplating the wildness of God's beauty, the visitors would recognize that the world in front of our own eyes needs to be transformed from a problem to be solved into a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise. I took this picture off the internet, and because of the rain, I haven't been able to go there, but I'm just saying, maybe there's something just around the corner from us right now that could be helpful with that, thinking about that Franciscan meditation about wildness in nature. You guys can find out. In her commentary on Laudato Si, the Argentine educator Ana Camburs de Donini wrote about the challenges to finding a path through Laudato Si to ecological citizenship. There are particular vices, she said, that are analyzed critically in the encyclical: consumerism, social exclusion, the abuse of power, and unbridled profiteering that inhibits an integral ecology and the development of a cultural encounter that promotes social justice. There are also a variety of interdisciplinary and intercultural projects that would facilitate a new approach to environmental education along the lines outlined in the encyclical. But, and this is an insight that I think carries well beyond Argentina, the biggest challenge, she says, is the silo-driven structure of the multiversity itself. Multiversity is a term used by former Harvard President Derek Bach, cited by her, to describe the radical and fragmenting compartmentalization of knowledge that takes place at the contemporary institution of higher learning. In response, she writes, in the face of this scenario, it appears necessary to rethink the idea and mission of the university that, in my judgment, must take its distance from the two models currently fighting for supremacy. The university as an ivory tower cut off from the immediate problems of society, and the managerial model that submits to the demands of the market and sometimes to the more immediate demands of society that can be approached by other institutions, end of quote. Camborda Nonini hits the nail on the head, in my opinion. Universities can cut themselves off from pressing social concerns in their very midst, or shunt their responsibility to ancillary bodies in government or industry. They are seldom good models of environmental stewardship in the fullest sense. The Franciscan Vision in Laudato Si shows that we can develop out of our Catholic tradition an overarching educational vision that avoids both the ivory tower and educational mercantilism. The Ignatian model grants us access to social engagement as a form of Christian discernment. Together, these spiritual resources assume a joint call to make connections that take us outside of our silos and to the side of the poor and marginalized. A new type of thinking is needed, one that's perhaps modeled on the geometrical figure of the polyhedron that Pope Francis likes to invoke when speaking about how to maintain real unity in the midst of real diversity. I have a separate whole essay on the polyhedron, but in these two soccer balls, I tried to summarize what it means for Pope Francis. Basically, he'll come into a room, and he uses it in a lot of different contexts. He'll come into a room and say, no more spheres, we need a polyhedron. Anyway, it's a very fully developed metaphor, but basically the sphere, because there's a uniform relationship between the center and circumference, wherever you're in the sphere, represents homogenization, whether it's interculturality, ecumenism, world religions, or multicultural corporations looking at the land. The sphere homogenizes. The polyhedron, as you see in this one figure of this, the polyhedron inside the circle, or the soccer ball that you can't really kick very well. The polyhedron has unity and diversity because there's multiple sets of relationships between center and circumference. That's his idea. But it's saying we need unity that's real unity, based on the unity we find in God, but that unfolds in terms of diversity. Another way, besides the polyhedron, to think about this would be to think of the university or the center of learning as the field hospital that brings us out to take care of the wounds of the world. Finally, to conclude, our view of the educational project must remain fixed on the person and testimony of Jesus Christ. There's no tunnel vision permitted in looking at Christ and gazing at Christ or in wearing his tau on one's breast. In doing so, we remain open to the surprisingly cosmic scope of what follows from that seemingly single-minded view. Austin Ivory likewise recounts a story of how Pope Francis sought to look at the wounded world from a different angle than we normally adopt. In October of 2017, he took the gospel of Jesus Christ directly to the heart of the big story by establishing a video link-up to the International Space Station, which was docked 220 miles beyond the Earth. There he encountered, and this is very timely, 3 Americans, 2 Russians, and an Italian named Paolo Nespoli, who was able to translate the messages from English to Italian. So there's also an intercultural dimension in going out into space. Citing Dante, the Pope asked cosmonaut Alex Misurkin whether love is the force that moves the universe. The cosmonaut answered, citing a text he had just read from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince. He said, love is the force that gives you strength to give your life for someone else. A U.S. Marine who had flown combat missions over Iraq described the overview effect of looking at the Earth from an almost God's eye view. Second Lieutenant Randy Bresnik said that from his weightless vantage point, the planet was turning peacefully on its axis, and the Earth looked awesomely beautiful and fragile. The Pope lit up with joy at this fitting answer. On Earth, we don't enjoy the view that comes from living at the International Space Station. In fact, when we read the daily news reports, it's easier to lose sight of what these explorers evince in their poetic descriptions of that vantage point and to become overly terrestrial. But as educators seeking, and as priests seeking to foster ecological conversion, we can attempt to evoke the same surprise and wonder that will allow our students to respond as the astronauts respond to the Pope. As Rachel Carson wrote 60 years ago in The Silent Spring, we too can see nature as a workshop in which God is allowing new realities to emerge every day. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.
We have time for a couple of questions, but we are going to have a reception as well, so there's also time to meet and talk with him personally.
Not all at once. Please. Mm-hmm.
Talk about the seemingly opposed ideas that enter into the polarity between them. Could you expound a little bit more on what ideas those ideas are, just as they're relevant to the crisis of the modern age?
Sure. So a very good, not to get totally pedantic, but a very good resource on this is Massimo Borghesi's The Mind of Pope Francis, which has a whole chapter on Gardini and a whole chapter on polarities and how it relates to spiritual exercises. But there's the so-called Bergoglian priorities that are developed in Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. But I think the most critical one is the relationship between reality and ideas. Like, how do you think about the relationship between reality and ideas? The kind of modern activists, I mentioned at the very beginning Hannah Arendt's lecture at the University of Chicago. The modern activist says, or the Marxist says that, philosophy hasn't changed the world. Only a revolutionary struggle is going to bring about that change. So philosophy is, wonder, contemplation, the whole vision is out. It's just about effective change and, joining to this class struggle where these two groups in society are diametrically opposed and are only going to be overcome through this ideal, Marx's relationship to Hegel. That's not going to work. On the other hand, I just need to know and understand whether it's a detached and narrowly Aristotelian view, or it's the Galilean scientific idea of the modern era where we can observe and experiment, put everything under a microscope, and we can see things. That's a necessary element, and I wanted to emphasize that. You need scientific scrutiny. You need to dissect the world to understand it, even in the social realm. But that has the exact opposite problem. So if you read the paragraphs, I don't know, it's like 224 or something like that, in The Joy of the Gospel on the priority of reality over ideas, he's not espousing pure contemplation, detached from engagement in the world, and he's not espousing any kind of, activism that doesn't think. He's saying that we need philosophy, we need a vision of the common good, but you also need a process of discernment. So the Jesuit, for him, it's always, it's not that he doesn't know about other spiritualities. He's not trying to make everyone into a Jesuit. Maybe he is, but that's what he knows. That was what is in his bones. And what's uncanny about this Gardini thing is that he has practically the same citation for the end of the modern world in the early writings when he's speaking to religious in Buenos Aires as he has in the encyclical. But to answer your question, so there's polarity between reality and ideas. It's not one or the other. We're always living in a tension. But a form of discernment is needed to get through it. And that's where I think the Ignatian contemplation action is the path that is natural to him and that he even uses in Laudato Si. Does that answer your question, or at least address it? Anyway, good question. Yeah, Father Christian.
How does the time and space dichotomy that shows up sometimes in Francis fit
Yeah.
Why say time is greater than space?
I had to think about that one for a long time. He does say time is greater than space. And he's got several sections of Evangelii Gaudium. And Scanoni has written, they're not in English, but Juan Carlos Scanoni was his Greek teacher way back in seminary days. I mean, be careful who teaches you Greek, because when you become Pope, then you bring him to Rome as your advisor. That's what we learned about that relationship. And I had the great pleasure of getting to know Juan Carlos, and I talked to him about some of these things. Anyway, to answer your question, Father, well, let me get a little bit concrete. So I went to San Miguel. Dr. Cerullo has been there with me in Argentina. And I asked, like, what did he teach? What was it really like? And the one thing that he engaged with, he did an early conference on intercultural reality, but one thing he engaged with, to the point of almost annoying the other people there, was God lives in the city, pastoral ministry. So in the context of doing ministry in Argentina, they always said he was too diocesan, he wasn't really Jesuit. Like, he didn't finish the dissertation in Germany. There were really a lot of snide things going on, but not that that would happen in a seminary. But what he was really thinking about was the problem of Buenos Aires and how do you engage it. And he didn't want to do it in terms of political programs or just, this legislation is opposed to that, this politician is opposed to that. And it wasn't just pious thoughts. So the example that he cited is Los Cartoneros, the cardboard box people. Well, first of all, there's the shantytown priest whom he espoused. They started the thing on their own because they worked in the poor areas on the outskirts. That's why he talks about going to peripheries. We have inner city poor. In Latin American metropolises, they have outer city poor. So that's why he's always talking about going to the peripheries. Anyway, the Cartoneros is a perfect example about time being greater than space, because basically the bag ladies and the poor men could turn in recycling for a small fee. But there was a certain period where Peronism wasn't working, imagine it, and there was a real problem of picking up trash in Buenos Aires. The bag ladies and the poor men who live in cardboard boxes, that's why it's named Cartoneros, formed a union. And they got all of the recycling out to a depository area on the outskirts, sorted it, and started a small-scale economy. That was a patient process. It wasn't anything from city planners. It came from the ground up. That's what, another example, and I'll end with this. The shantytown priests, at one point there was going to be a local election in Buenos Aires. They wrote a letter to the city. They didn't say who to vote for. They didn't even say what party to support. They said, think about the problem about electing a new city council as if you lived in the Las Villas, as if you lived in the shanty towns. And think of the city not from the center of commerce in the middle, but from the outskirts in. Invert your concept of the city. That's a slow, patient process. The most efficient architect and city planner who can put up a skyscraper is not going to solve the problems of the poor. You still need creativity to bring together the planning process with a creative process that's going to serve the people. But it requires the patience, Ignatian discernment, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I think that's about.
I think we have time for one more.
Could you give an example of the kind of an improper anthropocentrism that you mentioned, and then kind of what Pope Francis might mean by kind of a proper anthropocentrism to have in your view of the universe?
I think it's the same thing as this technocratic paradigm, that we don't get rid of technology. We can't. We don't get rid of, he taught chemistry in high school. He really valued the insights of technical experts. That's why I showed the slide of Canziani. He needed the technical experts in atmospheric physics at his side. So, one of the most common examples from his life is the question of the indigenous. Not as prevalent in Argentina as in nearby Bolivia, or in Chile, which he visited often, the question of extractivism. Multinational, because I lived a year in Chile, went to the English-speaking Mass in Santiago at the Holy Cross, And a lot of I have very nice people in my congregation who work for multinational congregations, corporations from Maryland, where I grew up, that were there doing engineering projects, trying to extract nice people. But writ large, I mean, corporations are coming to Latin America all over, extracting minerals from the ground, like the northern part of the deserts of Chile, or sometimes attending to the needs of the indigenous, the local people who've been there for centuries and have their own cosmovision, sometimes just extracting for the sake of profits. There's legal questions there, there's questions about nationality and peoplehood, but there's also an ethical concern. The common destination of all goods means that we can employ technology to serve people in concrete ways, sometimes in surprising ways, like letting the bag ladies have their own trade union. And we can find new forms of, he's not against capitalism, he's not against technology. We can find new ways of harnessing this technocratic power, but for the good of people, to directly serve the people. In the United, so that's a Latin American example. I mean, in my own teaching, just one, so my own teaching, a funny thing about Duke Divinity School, it's predominantly Protestant. We have a kind of small Catholic voice of rebels in the midst of it. But I've been teaching courses about Latinos in theology. And very close to the Divinity School is a huge Catholic parish that's over my own parish called Immaculate Conception, run by the Franciscans. It's 50% Hispanic. And almost everyone in these predominantly Protestants in my class has been to Latin America on service learning and is all souped up with all kinds of beautiful experiences and very sincere and good. But I said, you should accompany Hispanic people. Like, go to the parish down the street. It's walking distance from this classroom. They got so nervous. Some of them did it. It was really interesting. But they got so nervous about being there, like with the people that we were talking about. And it was a mutually beneficial relationship. I'm not talking down or anything. But so in my own concrete experience, trying to apply this in my own setting was to show that this kind of global awareness can start by going down the street to a religious congregation. Maybe it's a different denomination, maybe it's a different language, but getting to know the people there. You don't have to make huge trips to learn about global Christianity or even a new sense of the earth being our common home.
So the reception will be for all of our speakers. A reminder on the schedule tomorrow, we're turning to the science perspective with Philip, Jeff, and John. And we'll be looking at these questions from the perspective of physics and biology and astrophysics. So tonight was theology, tomorrow from a scientific perspective. We hope we can see you at the reception. Thank you. It's in the Alumni Commons. It's in the Alumni Commons.